Hello class, this is Hassan, and I'll be going over vulnerability assessment for my Windows Server 2019 and Linux Server 18.4 for IIS class 4200 Spring 2020. Next, I'll go over tools that we use to complete vulnerability assessment. Before we even perform vulnerability assessment, we use Nmap scan that is used to identify what service and ports are active on a server for verification. Nmap scan was performed on both Windows Server IP address 192.168.2.49 and Linux Server IP address 192.168.2.50. We also perform manual check for IP tables to check the rules for firewalls and make sure it was implemented correctly, and add more to make sure the security models were enforced. For vulnerability scan, we use Greenbone, which is used to identify what vulnerabilities are present so that the vulnerability might be remediated. In this slide, I'm going to discuss the firewalls. The firewalls was correctly installed and configured in both Windows Server and Linux, and I manually checked to verify all the rules are correct and the default policies was set to drop. AppArmor was properly installed and configured. AppArmor was also manually checked and all the profiles were installed and running, and all the confined process was also running. In this slide, I will go over Nmap scan that verified services and port before we implemented Greenbone vulnerability scanning. I'll start with Windows Server 2019. Windows Server was active and running. Firewall was properly configured. The IIS service was up with DNS running on port 53. HTTPS running on port 443, and SMTPS running on port 465. Next, I'll go over Nmap that verify ports and services for Linux 18.4. IP tables was installed and properly configured. AppArmor was installed and properly configured. OpenSSH was installed and properly configured and running SSH on port 22. Postfix was installed and properly configured and was running SMTP on port 25, which I later disabled it to use port 465 for SMTPS. Bind was properly configured and installed and was running DNS on port 53. Dovecot was installed and properly configured and was running POP3 on port 110, and I changed it to a secure port for POP3S, which is port 995. IMAP was installed and properly configured and it was running on port 143, and I disabled it for secured port 993 IMAPs. Apache was installed and properly configured and it was running HTTP port 80, and I later disabled that port and changed it to port 443, which is HTTPS, a secured port. Postgres was installed and running and was running database on port 5432. In this slide, I'll go over Greenbone security issues that was identified and accessed for. For the Windows Server, we will access Windows operating system, firewalls, HTTP, HTTPS, SMTP, and DNS. For Linux Server, we will access operating system, firewalls, AppArmor, HTTP, HTTPS, POP3, SMTP, IMAP, DNS, database, and SSH. Before I moved on vulnerability scan details for Windows Server and Linux Server, I want to address vulnerability ranking scale. Greenbone uses CVSS, which stands for Common Vulnerability Scoring System, that assesses severities for vulnerabilities and then assigns severity scores, allowing responder to prioritize and respond the threat accordingly. Starting from low to the most critical vulnerabilities, low-ranking vulnerabilities are unlikely to be exploited based on the vulnerabilities, and then further actions might not be required for the low vulnerabilities. Medium-ranking vulnerabilities are susceptible to be exploited at some point and must be addressed and resolved. High-ranking vulnerabilities are highly to be exploited and need to be addressed and resolved as soon as possible. Critical vulnerabilities are extremely high to be exploited and need to be resolved immediately or as soon as possible. Next, I'll discuss about the Greenbone results. For the Windows Server, the IP address that was scanned was 192.168.2.50, and the result shows no vulnerabilities, meaning that the server was properly secured, configured, and hardened. Vulnerabilities were unlikely to be exploited, and no further action was needed at that time. In this slide, I'll discuss about the Greenbone results for the Linux server, and the IP address that was scanned was 192.168.2.49, and the vulnerability result shows 0 vulnerabilities, meaning that the server was securely configured and hardened. Vulnerabilities were unlikely to be exploited and no further action was needed at that time. In this slide, I'm going to discuss the recommendation for vulnerabilities found on Linux and Windows Server. Since both Windows Server 2019 and Linux 18.4 shows 0 vulnerabilities, no further action is needed or recommended at this time. Conclusion. At the end note, I would like to say both Windows Server and Linux servers were properly hardened and meet the requirement for this class. Hardening our servers means advanced security measures were put in place during the server hardening process, and this means more secure server environment. Thank you.